Hello and welcome back, and that is right, today on this messy table, today I want to talk about this. This is the PHALCOMM L8 NAS enclosure. I tend to look at a lot of different NAS enclosures here on the channel, but this has kind of come as something of a request. This is one that isn't really available to find anywhere online. I've seen it crop up a couple of times on eBay and a few different forums out there highlighting it, and this 8-bay ATX and ITX ready NAS server has kind of piqued a few people's interest. It does things a little differently, and in this video we're going to talk about things that I like about it and things that I would argue are kind of peculiar. One of the main reasons I think this has drawn a lot of attention, particularly for the users that have got a high recycle rate on their drives, is to do with the top here. The top of this case has a magnetic panel that comes off like so, and that magnetic panel gives way to 8 individual SATA bays there on the front, each one of those supporting a 3.5 inch SATA hard drive. Now you can't buy the device with a motherboard or any of that stuff included, no PSU, but I will say that during my extensive kind of playing around and testing and measuring of this case, I will say you can fit pretty much anything in there. Straight away, stuff here we've got on the table. We've got this big old fat heatsink MITX Mobo here, and that fitted inside there like an absolute charm. Indeed, it took up so little of the room inside, it became very clear just how extensive you could expand within this chassis. When I went ahead and installed in a lovely little ATX board here, again with a massive heatsink there on board, it fit in like an absolute glove. The hard drive cage, those 6 individual bays, can actually be lifted out. Obviously, you'd rather keep them in, but the idea is that drives are mounted via these 2 individual clips here on the side of each and every drive, and they are slotted in like so. And you slide them into the system. Now, straight away, you may have noticed they don't go in easy. It meets the SATA connector on the inside there, but those drives don't exactly slide in smoothly there, which I think is going to be a problem when you want to remove drives, especially if you were to fully populate this with individual drives inside those. If you had 8 bays in here, and say bay 3 or 4 has an issue, removing a drive from this is actually not that straightforward. So I'm kind of surprised that alongside this myriad of these little clips here that we put on our drives, there isn't any handles on these drives. I would have liked to have seen kind of an ejection mechanic perhaps, or at least simply just handles on these drives. I'm not a huge fan of these little clips here. They are quite solid. There's no kind of rubberness to them, so they're not sliding inside and, you know, being permeable to the sides of the enclosure on the inside. In reality, they are pushed against the metal on either side, and that doesn't really do anything to dissipate vibration when the system's in operation. Now, that 200 nicker price tag, that gets you the case. It gets you the case. It also gets you a bunch of accessories. As you can see there on the rear, we've got absolutely loads of PCIe upgrade slots there, and we've got that standard backplane there where our output for our ports and connections on the back of that Mobo are going to live. There's an absolute ton of ventilation on practically every single side, barring the bottom. But I will say, one of the things that a wall I kind of hit during this was the cavity inside for both a CPU cooler and the PSU. Now, it supports under 160mm or 158mm, I should say, CPU cooler, and that is alongside a 160mm PSU. Now, this is a chunky monkey of a PSU. I'm going to say right now, this ATX, and this does support ATX PSUs, is too big for this. But I would also argue that the space allocated to the CPU cooler and the PSU in this is pretty darn tight. The system doesn't utilize your standard slot load-in method for the PSU. It actually uses one of those extension cables with the angular PSU connector mains power adapter on the end. And the PSU sits in a really odd location. As I'm sure the graphics on screen are showing right now, the PSU sits just above the motherboard. It actually sits nestled directly next to that CPU cooler. That is not a lot of space to play with. Now the ventilation is still piping all the way through, thanks to the fan being based on the side onto a ventilated panel on the side of the chassis, and it's actually raised ever so slightly by multiple little copper threads here that go on the end of the PSU to raise it from the edge of the wall to factor in that extension cable there on the side. That's all fair and well, but that means that some of that space that you're using up there is being allocated by these, which brings it even closer to the CPU cooler inside. Next, let's talk about fans and cooling. Now, this case actually has two separate areas, three technically, areas where you can mount optional fans. There are no fans included with this, which I think at that price point feels a little mean, I'll be honest. Firstly, you've got an overhanging frame that lives over the top just next to, running parallel to the storage bays there. You can mount two individual 120mm fans to there. Also, based in the front of the chassis, behind that front panel there, you have got a cavity to also install two more 120mm fans. But keep in mind, you are going to need to use thinner fans. Hopefully as the images show you on screen, the standard class fans that I use for pretty much all of my builds were just a little too fat to be used in that cavity. So do keep it in mind, you're going to need to maybe shop around for those fans, because once you install them inside, the alignment for the front removable panel will just be too far out. There's also an additional 80mm fan cavity on the rear for you to mount another fan. And again, if you've got enough fan output, power outputs on your Mobo, knock yourself out. But talking of outputs, returning to the subject of storage, let's talk about that cage that all 8 of those SATA drives are inside. As mentioned, it's a separate metal cage that rests above everything else just to the front of the chassis, and it's held in place by 4 screws individually, and the vibration is alright. So I will say again, if you use larger drives that are really going to be packed in quite heavy, that in of themselves have a higher click, spin, etc., noise is not going to be low on a chassis like this. But what's really weird is when I looked at the rear of that cage to see where the inputs and outputs are going to run there. Every one of them has its own SATA input there. So there is no SAS fan out that it's all being fed into like an SFF or anything like that. They are individual SATA outputs, which means you're going to need to factor that into your Mobo, or get a Mobo that takes advantage of those SFF fan out connections. But what I will also add, annoyingly, is on the rear of it, you've got 4 individual Molexes. Now, I've already spoke to the brand. I asked them about those 4 Molexes, which seemed to me excessive. That was 1 Molex for every 2 drives, when most builds that have got 8 bays that I have seen get away with 2, or even just 2 and a SATA input. You're going to have to dick around with a lot of adapters. The brand says that you can power all 8 drives off just 2 SATAs, and the other 2 SATAs there are there just as failover, which sounds odd, but still nonetheless, if it can run on those 2 SATAs, fantastic. I populated this with 4 TBs, and I was able to run it on the 2 SATA Molex inputs, but I will say that was for 4 TB Seagate Iron Wolves. I can't speak for if I populated the whole thing with 24 TBs. I didn't have 8 24 TBs knocking around. I'm not going to say this case doesn't feel a little budget, because frankly, it does. It feels like it costs about 10-15% more than it should. I found it very hard online to get a lot of the detailed specifications, and although the brand, when I reached out to them, were able to supply a lot of that information, it wasn't more readily accessible online. And I think a lot of that was why users were asking me to get hold of one of these and review it. It was simply that there just wasn't a lot of information online, for good or for bad. Do I recommend this case? Yes, with a bunch of caveats. I do think the Johnsbow N3 is a better 8-bay chassis overall, although that does limit you to ITX, of course. And, we've talked about it many times before. It's just off camera there. The Johnsbow N5 is still, for me, the current score to beat. And at the 150, 200 nicker mark, depending on your tax and the shipping, this just feels a little bit too expensive for what is feeling like a very basic box. I would have loved a better approach to this SATA storage area here at the top. I like that it includes the magnetic dust panel on the top, fantastic, but ejection of drives does not feel smooth. Even the injection of drives did not feel smooth. A nice button ejection system, maybe even trays that lift it up and out, would have been preferable to having drives that are slotted in but incredibly inconvenient to take out. Hello, this is just Rob from the future jumping in here. After I've completed my review of the PHALCOMM L8, I reached out to the brand just to let them know some of the issues that I encountered and some of the problems that I kind of thought I wanted to highlight in the video. I wanted to give them the right of reply. Luckily, they were able to turn around a response pretty quickly on this, and I just wanted to add this into the video, some of the details that I've got from them on some of the issues that I encountered on this system. Probably one of the biggest ones, the ones that I frankly made the most laboured point about, was to do with the way you inserted drives inside this. They reached out and said that they're actually working on and now have completed rollout of a better way of doing it, in their own words, and that is utilising these hard drive covers here. So rather than just utilising that magnetic top panel, they are now including with this device in this latest rollout of these. So hopefully this is the unit you'll get. These don't cost any extra. They're not an optional accessory. I asked them several times. This system arrives with these clips that go on the top of every one of your drives, and these allow you to not only have a cover that goes on top of those rather than the dust cover, but they say makes them easier to insert and withdraw from the system. I will say, I didn't feel that they improved the experience that much. I'm sure you can see them from the images on screen. The drive still didn't exactly come out very smoothly for me, and yes, I'm still using a larger drive here, but I think with only 8 bays of storage in there, and you think 5 to 10 years of data, you're going to go for big drives as well. So I appreciate what they've done with these levered covers, but I'm not going to say that's fundamentally changed my opinions about those trays there. The other thing was when I was talking a lot more about the placement of the PSU and the placement of the CPU cooler and how they seem to be rather close together, and the brand actually had a great deal to say about it. So much so that I think rather than me trying to reiterate it, I think it would be a lot better to hear their own words. Come on, Mr. AI, crack it out.
This cover plate is mainly designed to solve the problem of difficulty in unplugging the hard drive that customers have reported. For the structural part, our design intention was to enable users to build a NAS without spending a lot of cost with their second-hand accessories. After conducting user data research, we found that many users have standard ATX power supplies, as well as a mid-tower heatsink. In addition, many users have eliminated ATX motherboards or MATX motherboards. Therefore, we developed this product around these 3 main stagnant hardware. Therefore, in some cases of flat heatsinks or flagship heatsinks, this case is not so user-friendly because we designed it for most stagnant computer hardware. When planning the hardware projection layout of this case, we used these 2 feature points. With the increase of CPU power consumption in recent years, the area of MOS heatsinks has gradually increased. Therefore, some motherboard CPU mounts meet the requirements on the diagram. In this case, a dual-tower, single-fan heatsink can be installed. Even some old models of motherboards comply with this design rule. If you are using a motherboard with a width of less than 245 mm or a motherboard with a CPU mount at the back, you can use a single tower heatsink with memory avoidance design. This type of heatsink is used to avoid the height of the memory. In our product, if the power supply collides with the heatsink due to the issue mentioned earlier, we can reverse the tower of this heatsink to avoid the power supply and install it smoothly. The fan is still installed in the front. Although the fan will be raised due to the memory, our case has enough height to avoid compatibility issues with the top fan. In conjunction with the PSU's built-in cooling fan, a complete forward and backward airflow channel can be constructed in this case, and in the NAS environment. The temperature of the CPU's heatsink is not high, and the exhaust gas discharged will not heat the PSU. Our hard drive track design retains the shock absorption of the XY axis of the hard drive. We have seen that you mentioned in your article that silicone has better shock absorption function. However, during our testing process, we found that silicone loses its elasticity due to long-term high-temperature aging, which makes it unable to absorb the vibration of the hard drive and poses a risk of debris being sucked into the cooling fan.
Now, I'll say right now, not much of that fundamentally changes my original opinion about this device. I'm still re-recording the conclusion here, but I will say I've updated the article below and I wanted to update this video in line with what they spoke to me about. Now, saying that the confliction of some of those hardware components is actually so they can facilitate legacy or, you know, stop e-waste. Sounds nice, but you're still buying a new case. I think if you were going down that road, you'd just reuse an old PC case. Also, although these are actually quite nice on the eye, I won't say these fundamentally change anything about the injection, ejection method of the hard drives going in and out of this system. I think it is a nice compact M80X case there. I think it's a huge scope for PCIe scalability. I just still feel that ventilation and airflow on this is somewhat up for debate, and I don't really like the way the PSU is loaded into this with those little external risers there, and its proximity there so close to the CPU, and the fact that the fan placement and the fan insertion methodology around this. Yes, they're trying to maintain a compact enclosure, but I'm still not convinced by it. I feel ever so slightly better about the case than I did originally when I recorded this review, hence the new outro for this. So if you were one of the early access users, you probably saw the original ending of this video. But I still don't think this thing stacks up against the Johns Bows or the Fractal Nodes in the market or the Silverstones. It's a good compact M80X case there, but I don't think I would consider it a pro power user case there due to my concerns about airflow, temperatures, and the injection ejection method. I wish there were buttons that I could just press to get those drives out easier, spring-loaded something, or logical trays, because this thing at the top, that ain't a tray to me. That's a hat at best. Thank you so much for watching. There are links in the description to get hold of this case if you are interested in it, as well as links below to the full written review, so do check that out. If you want to learn more, use those links. If you are going to get hold of this case and you like it and you want to support the channel and you're going to go to those stores in the description anyway, please use those links. It helps me and Eddie out at NAS Compares to keep doing what we do. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching, and have yourselves a fantastic week.